Welcome everybody. My name is Sam Settlemyre. I am joined here with Greg Torres. We're at Civic Garden Center. I work for the Civic Garden Center. I'm the community engagement coordinator here, and I'm joined by our guest tonight, Greg Torres, former horticulturist here at the Garden Center. He's now at the Cincinnati Parks within their conservation and land management division. He is also a co-host of the Nature Guys podcast and a widely recognized native plant expert here in the Cincinnati area. So going to be talking just a little bit about native plants tonight. Greg, thanks for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. One of my favorite things to do and talk about getting involved with native plants. Yeah.
Great. Well, we're going to start off. Let's see. There we go. They are getting people in here. If you have questions tonight, please do throw them in the chat function. We will be trying to monitor that as best we can, and we will be using that chat function to guide some of our conversation tonight. If we have any trouble accessing that, we'll reassess as we go. We're definitely not Facebook Live experts here, but we're going to do our best. So to start out, we're going to talk a little bit about why we're doing this at the beginning of April. So, Greg, what is April? Is any reason April is special in terms of native plants?
Well, April showers bring the May flowers, but in this time of the year, in our spring time, especially in the forest, we have a number of plants that are actually blooming and already carrying out their life cycle. Some of them are already dormant at this point, like Harbinger Spring is starting to peter out and go away already. So early springtime is a real crucial period for our spring flowers here, especially in our forest ecosystems.
And for that very reason, they selected April as Native Plant Month. So going back to 2019 now, we passed a bill here in Ohio for the state of Ohio that recognized April as Ohio Native Plant Month. And we were one of the first states in the country, I believe the first state in the country, to pass that bill and to recognize April as Native Plant Month, a month that we can recognize, celebrate, promote, educate all about native plants, why they're important, what they are, trying to get people to wake up to this idea of native plants and getting them especially in their own yards. And within the last 2 years now, we have had some exciting developments thanks to the work of Nancy Linz, Hope Taft, and a number of other native plant enthusiasts out there who have taken this on a national level and have made it National Native Plant Month. So a bill was passed by Congress this year and actually last year and is continued on to this year, recognizing April as National Native Plant Month. So promoting all across the country native plants, trying to get more and more organizations like the Civic Garden Center to promote native plants, trying to get more and more people to recognize the importance of it and to make sure that they're not only celebrating it by maybe planting native in their own yard, maybe doing something to get rid of the invasive plants in their yard, but also to promote to their friends, families, neighbors, whoever it might be, that native plants are important. So we're going to use that to kick off our conversation tonight. And
I got a question.
Oh,
we'll throw it out and we'll see if anybody answers it from the audience. What is Ohio's native plant?
This is
the one that we celebrate for Ohio Native Plant Month. That's the question. So let's see if we get any answers to that.
All right, we'll circle back to that here in a few minutes. So our first question tonight for our guest, Mr. Greg Torres, is going to be, what is a native plant? Greg?
These loaded nature questions. First and foremost, I'll just say thanks. And then second to that, anything you're dealing with nature, you need to take with a grain of salt because there's always, it's all gray. There's nothing really black and white, right? So, this continent used to be on a different part of the planet hundreds of thousands of years ago. So these things, they change, they shift, and that's part of the beauty of life on this planet. It's very adaptable. But normally when people are talking about native plants, they're talking about plants that occur in your region before European settlements, before Europeans started really bringing wholesale large quantities of species and other organisms to North America. So it's whatever was here in the historical context, yeah.
Great. And I do see that we did have a friend of ours, Mr. Brendan Bogosian, answer our question, what is Ohio's native plant? Greg, would you like to answer that?
Trillium grandiflorum. He even gave us the scientific name. Trillium literally means 3 lily, so trillium. And then grandiflorum means large flower. So the large flower white trillium, which is our native trillium to Ohio. We have a number of native trilliums. The one you're going to most often see here in Ohio in our forest is going to be toadshade trillium. But there are a number of other ones like nodding trillium, white trillium. You'll see that as well. But there's about 8 species, give or take, in Ohio of trillium, just trillium.
Great.
Yeah.
So one thing, quick reminder for those of you who have joined us. First of all, thank you for joining us. Please do throw those questions in the chat. We are going to try to use as many of those questions about native plants to guide this conversation tonight. We have a couple of questions, and we're happy to sit here and talk native plants all night long, but we're hoping that you guys can help us guide this conversation a little bit. So please do jump in and make sure you're adding into that chat function some of these questions, whether it be general questions about native plants, whether it be general questions about how you integrate them into your own yard. Maybe you have a more forested landscape. We're happy to cover the gambit in that regard. So we already answered that question of what is a native plant exactly. Let's move on to why we should care about native plants over other plants.
Yeah, which kind of informs why there was a push for a native plant month, right? Why should we care about these things? It is our natural history here in Ohio, right? This is our natural history. And if you've looked around this spring right now, this is a perfect time to see it. You see Callery pear blooming, you see lesser celandine blooming, and you already see honeysuckle leafing out, right? All of these are non-native plants. These are plants from other continents. And while we have maybe a gardening relationship or some historical context to them as well, our native flora directly feed and support all of our native fauna, right? So that's why it matters. Right now, this time of year, instead of Callery pear and lesser celandine blooming, we should be seeing bluebells, we should be seeing trout lilies, we should be seeing a number of our native plants blooming. And what they do is they provide the nectar and pollen early in the season, right? Like we're talking February in some cases. I mean, if you include skunk cabbage, it could be even earlier than that. But they provide a lot of early resources for our native fauna, especially the insects, to really jumpstart the whole springtime revival. And so to have those flowers in a diversity of flowers, not just Callery pear down every street, but a diversity of flowers provides variable nectar, so different nutrient qualities for from different plants to all these insects and other creatures that will be using them. There's so many reasons. That's a really large question. Why does it matter? As far as biodiversity, just maintaining our biodiversity, that matters. A number of our native plants haven't even had research done on them yet, and yet we're losing them very quickly to, again, like lesser celandine, where you can find populations in the woods of native plants struggling while they're being squished by this like rubbery, like crappy yellow flowering buttercup that's quickly taken over all of Cincinnati. So a lot of our native plants directly support our native insects, right? So like cutleaf toothwort, which should be out right now, blooming, it supports a number of our native pollinators, butterfly species, like the orange-tipped falcate, beautiful butterfly. If you haven't seen it, maybe you need more toothwort in your life, because then you might see more of them floating around. But when we see a preponderance of lesser celandine, which nothing eats, right, because it's actually toxic, the caterpillars aren't supported, the butterflies aren't supported, the birds aren't supported. We need the birds. They'll be needing caterpillars. They're about to show up and are showing up right now. And if they don't have the food to feed their babies, primarily caterpillars, then the whole population starts to decline. It's this manifold situation where if we don't have the plant community intact, everything else kind of falls apart.
Right. So I think we touched on a number of really great topics right there, and it is a loaded question. So I apologize for maybe putting up something that's a little too big to tackle. But what about maybe we can find one relationship? What is maybe one example of a relationship, maybe insect to flower, that is, specifically native plant to native insect? I think a lot of times when we're talking pollinators, especially save the pollinators, people get so wrapped up in our friend the honeybee that they oftentimes overlook these native insects, especially these native bees, which are oftentimes much smaller, much less noticeable in the garden space, and so we oftentimes don't necessarily pay attention to them. But we see a honeybee in the garden, and we say, all right, great, there's pollinators, I'm doing good things for the environment. But some of our honeybees aren't so good at pollinating some of those native plants. Can we maybe talk about a relationship there?
Sure. Go in the woods, spend some time looking at the flowers there, and you'll see some honeybees, but you won't see very many. They don't belong in the woods. They aren't adapted to some of these exquisite flowers we have. I think right off the bat of Dutchman's breeches, which is a very unique plant. It's got these, it kind of looks like this. They say it looks like a Dutchman's pants hanging in the wind, but I don't know what that means. So it looks like this, it looks like a V, and it's got these two spikes at the tips, and that's where the nectar is, right at the tips. This plant, all the floral parts, all the petals in that, they're fused together into this unique shape, and honeybees can't access the nectaries inside the petals. They just aren't capable of pushing the petals apart. You need a very strong bee capable of pushing those petals apart. And then you need one specifically with a long tongue to be able to access the nectary at the tip of that flower. So you need probably a bumblebee, strong enough to push the flower apart. I mean, they're brawny little things, right? They push it apart, and then they can access the nectary at the tip of the petals there. But honeybees, they're not strong enough to do that. I'll give you another great one. Everybody knows milkweed and its connection. We'll get into the host plant thing in just a moment, but take a real good look sometimes at Asclepias syriaca, the wild milkweed, right? If you have it growing, sometimes it's interesting. You'll see on the flowers, because milkweed flowers are very unique, right, in the way they're structured. They have these slits in the flowers that a bee has to get his foot stuck in it and then pull out a packet of pollen to then fly, and then it's got to get his foot stuck in the slit again on another flower and deposit that packet, or that pollen, right? But if the bee, like honeybees, aren't strong enough, they'll get their legs stuck in that flower, and when they try to leave, they can't leave, and they die on that flower. That doesn't seem ideal, right? So it shows that this insect is not at all adapted to these native flowers that we have. They actually die in some cases because they're just not strong enough to get out of the pollination trap.
Wow.
Which is awesome because our native bees are totally built for it. So it's cool, yeah.
Very cool. Well, I think that brings up one really good point, which is observation. You know, there's so many of these complex relationships, many of which we hardly even understand, and without just going out there and spending some time looking around your garden, there's a whole lot of things that you're going to miss. So I do see that we have some questions coming in. So we are going to get to those here in just a minute, but I do want to tee up one last question before we go to some of our questions that we're getting in the comments section. A lot of our questions that we're getting right now are related to people's yards. What to plant where, what to plant that's native in certain conditions. But why do we care about planting native plants in our yard? And especially in the context of maybe today's world, why is it so important to talk about native plants not only out in the forest or out in these big natural spaces, but right in your yard, whether it be a quarter of an acre, whether you have 2 or 3 acres? Why is that important to have your native plants right in your own yard?
So I'm gonna be a little pushy for a minute. If your main concern and you have money and time to just focus on beautifying your landscape, but you aren't trying to help in some way our natural spaces because they're facing the same issues with invasive species, I think you need to pay attention to that. Because we are living in the 6th mass extinction on the planet. This is happening now, right? And just take a drive around and you can see these plants are blooming right now that don't belong here. So for me, my first priority is the forest and keeping the natural ecosystems that we have intact. Now, what homeowners can do is add to that, right? And that's where your home becomes more than just your personal interest, right? For me, people are allowed to do what they want in their homes, right? In their properties and that, and I respect that. But on the other hand, if what you are doing on your land is actively destroying other parts of the community, the local ecosystem and that, then I think it's time to face responsibility. And that's what I guess we're trying to do here today, is talk about how to get these plants in our yards and that. I think observation, what you said, first, is a really good thing. So just go out and see. Visit different forests, visit different ecosystems. If you got a bright, blazing side of a hill, southern facing slope, go find an ecosystem that has that and go hike around and see what's there. Learn about it. One, you'll learn about the native ecosystem, but two, you'll know what to plant in that space. So there's a multitude of variables. People, I'm sure, will want to know specifics to their own home. But my best suggestion is go pay attention to what's out there in the ecosystem. Like if you got a wetland area, then go visit a wetland area and see what might be growing along that to contribute. And do a little bit of research too, because there's plants that might not be in that specific wetland, but around the corner they might exist. So do some research, but we can get into a little bit more specifics as we
Yeah, we're definitely going to circle back to that topic because, as you said, there's just so much there to unpack. And so I do want to get to a couple of people's questions before we dive too deep and go too far off tangent, getting into these issues. But it is incredibly important, and I do also want to mention the name of Doug Tallamy, and that's another name that we're going to circle back to in terms of why your yard is so important. So if you don't know that name, do some Googling while we're talking here, and we'll circle back to it here in just a bit. But let's look at one of our questions here. So we have, what would be a good native tree for the front garden bed? So we're thinking probably, we don't want to go maybe too crazy big, or maybe we want something a little bit showier. If we're thinking aesthetics for that front garden bed, what are we thinking, Greg?
So personally, I've got 3 redbud planted in my front yard. They're beautiful, right? Beautiful heart-shaped leaves. They're in the Fabaceae family of plants, so they will kind of take care of the land around them as well. Beyond that, they're beautiful. They should be blooming just about now. If we get a warm day, they might really start popping off. But they're a lavender, pinky color. There's even varieties that are white, but stick with the natives and you're going to get a beautiful lavender color plant right now in your yard. I would also recommend serviceberry. Everybody's got these Bradford pears or these calorie pears planted in the yard. Cut it down ASAP, like today. Be a good day to do it. Yesterday would have been a better one. But cut it down and put a serviceberry in its place. It's going to be blooming maybe in another week or 2. Mine are at my house. And they got the showy white flowers that you're looking for, and they're a small shrub. There's different varieties too. Some are multi-stemmed. Some are just straight trunked. But all of them will be blooming soon in the spring, producing berries that are delicious if you get your hands on them. But if you don't, the birds will. And it's just great bird food as they make their arrival here in our local ecosystem. So yeah, serviceberry is another great one. There's a bunch of them too. There's some really cool plants out there. Yeah.
Well, I think that touches on a really important point too, is not only to think about the aesthetics and beauty for you, or maybe even the food sources for you, but what are the food sources in your yard for the native, fauna? What are the insects, or what type of berries do you have that are going to support the native birds? Be able to have those food sources available throughout the year. Because I think we get so wrapped up in that aesthetics piece that sometimes we forget that our yards are important for that too.
And you mentioned Doug Tallamy, and the other day I was listening to an interview he was giving, and he made this profound point, and it's truly monumental. He stated that this is the first generation where we have to garden for other organisms than just ourselves. We are responsible now because we've taken up so much land to garden for these other creatures, like the birds that show up. We have to feed them. It's in our hands now. The insects, if they don't find their food sources, they will go away. And when you can drive for miles and it's just developed by human hands, where do these creatures get their food then? It's got to be from us at this point. So it's scary, but also very encouraging, because you can make a difference. And when you plant the right things, they show up, right? And this goes to the host plants, which I wanted to bring up. Everybody talks about pollinators and how you get these things in your yard, and they want the showiness, right? They want the flowers. And I get that, because that's really attractive, the flowers. But that's only half the equation. That's what feeds the adult animals, right? That's what feeds the adult butterflies. That's what feeds the adult bees and that. You definitely need to be concerned also with the young. If you want really a lot of pollinators in the yard, you got to plant the host plants as well. And they might not be showy, like Dutchman's pipe, Aristolochia, right? It feeds the pipevine swallowtail. gosh, my brain's fried. It feeds the pipevine swallowtail, but it is not a very attractive plant. It's a sprawly looking vine. It can be pretty in the right spot, but like if you don't have that plant, you won't get this butterfly, and this butterfly is what people want in their yards. So plant that, you get these awesome caterpillars, especially if you got kids. Kids love that stuff. You can catch them and feed them the leaves, and they watch. You can teach the whole thing. Our native plants provide opportunities to teach our kids about our natural history, about these processes, about all of it. And it matters a lot to me because that's where I grew up. You know, I grew up learning about this stuff. Before I could even remember, I was catching caterpillars and putting leaves in them just to watch them develop into things. So, yeah.
Very powerful. Yeah. Well, I think that, you know, kind of starts to lead in. We can kind of stick with that host plant mentality as we go to our next question, which is a good replacement for some of these mid-sized shrubs. So someone said they had removed some mid-sized shrubs recently. They're looking for some replacements. I can think of at least one. What are some mid-sized shrubs? I'm thinking spice bush is one.
That's a great one. Especially if you got like a part shady area in your yard. It hosts the spice bush or the spice bush, swallowtail, cat, butterfly. My brain is really fried this morning, or this evening. So it hosts this awesome caterpillar and this awesome butterfly, and you don't have that plant or a sassafras, you won't get this caterpillar, you won't get this butterfly. Beyond that, I would go with some shrub dogwoods. So like gray dogwood or, what's the other one? Gray dogwood's a great one. That's a really tolerant plant. I've got that one in my yard. But all of them will produce, all the shrub dogwoods will produce this head of small, creamy white flowers. A lot of insects are on that. I've had swallowtail butterflies on it, all the way to like scarab beetles, little tiny beetles pollinating it. Later on, though, they'll produce berries, and the birds will eat those berries, which is what you want, right around the fall when they're about to make their migration, which it's all great ecosystem habitat. You can build this in your own yard. It's nothing more delightful, right, than to plant something, watch it flower, then watch it fruit, and then watch. I mean, it's great if you can eat it. That's really fulfilling. But if some other animal, if you planted it with an intention of some other animal eating that, and then it happens, it makes you feel like you did something, and you can do something. So it's important. Yeah. Shrub dogwood, I go wahoo. That's a cool one. Eastern wahoo. Witch hazels are great. I love witch hazels. They smell fantastic. Really interesting bloom time too, when like nothing else is about to pop out. Service berries, I mentioned that. Oh Lord, there's a bunch of others. I'll probably think of some more as we go.
Great. Let's see what else we got in here. Oh, this is one that I hear all the time. People go in their yard, you know, they hear some of these types of talks, they get really fired up about the invasive plant, you know, movement, and so they really want to get stuff out of their yard. And one of the first and easiest things is to go after the honeysuckle, right? We just talked about our mid-sized shrubs, but you know, another one that's really relatively easy to go after is the ground cover, right? We get a lot of these vines. You know, people have English ivy, winter creeper, a lot of these different vines that are mixed into their yard, whether it's coming from something they planted many years ago, whether it be coming from their neighbor's yard. A lot of these are, you know, just all over the place. And the more you start to do some hiking around some of our Cincinnati parks, the more you're going to see this ground cover just getting dominated by some of these plants. But as we think about removal, right, we get them all out of there. We free up some space in the garden, especially in a shady spot. What's a good native ground cover to come back in there and replant?
Yeah. So let's break down that word first. Ground cover. Right, ground cover. That should send off like alarm bells because you don't see that in nature. You don't see in nature just a covering of one plant just covering the entire ground. That's not, purge that from your mind. That's not what you want in your garden. You want a multitude of different things, right? You want some diversity because that's when you're really going to get benefits for the ecosystem, right? Plus, it's more interesting to have a diversity of things than just a ground cover, which just sounds lame to begin with. So, wild ginger, throw some of that in your yard, right? That'll start to push its way out, especially in a shady area. It likes really crappy soils like we have here in Ohio. Clay, sometimes dry in the middle of you know, the summer. It will start to fade away later in the season, right? But that's what these things are made to do. They're intended to fade away. That's, though, a great, like, leafy ground cover. I like, if you got the right spot, Tiarella cordifolia, foam flower. Really beautiful plant, right? And it spreads out via stolons. So it'll spread out and root in, spread out and root in. Kind of like mints do. But that's got a beautiful flower, and its foliage will actually stay out. It'll fade to like maroon and even like a purpley color. So it provides some really great interest in your yard, like even in the fall going into the winter. But again, I will emphasize, ground cover is not what you're looking for. It'd be best to plant a number of things that all serve different benefits and all serve different organisms. That would be ideal, because you don't see a ground cover situation in nature very often.
And I think that raises an excellent point in this native plant conversation, which is perception. You know,
Yeah.
we think of this idea of gardening, especially in the traditional sense, where, you know, you are filling in every aspect of the garden, and whether it be with ornamentals and different types of annuals, right? You're filling in almost all the gaps, because this whole nice packed in full bed has this really nice kind of aesthetic to it, but that's not what's natural, right? We're doing the hike in the woods, you're going out and seeing these spaces. That's really not what is supposed to be there. So I think that's a really important point. Really important point for tonight is that perception aspect. Is, you know, some of these perceptions that we have about our own yard may not necessarily be what is best for the native plant community.
Like leaf litter, right? Like just plain old leaves left in the garden, right? That's been a new thing. I've seen a lot of it talked about this year, but like we've normally got all that out of the yard, blow it all out of here, but like we've learned a lot of that. Like a lot of that leaf litter is organic material, nutrients for a whole slew of organisms. But also, without that leaf litter, some of our native plants that you're trying to get established in your garden just might not thrive without that humus-rich leaf covering, especially during the wintertime, or some of the seeds might not settle in, or if they do and you have nothing there for them to like settle in under, they'll just dry out right on the surface there, and you won't get the native thing. What you have in your mind is like a native plant garden won't happen unless you really start acting like a wild space, you know? And I don't mean like just let the wild things go, but like you have to mimic those natural processes. You have to mimic like the leaf litter in the forest, or the way things will dry out and hang tight through the winter. Like there's animals that live in those stems, so you need to kind of mimic those processes. It's not how we've done things, but as you're saying, this is honestly where the whole movement needs to go, because to say what Shalini said before, it's the first time we actually have to garden for things beyond ourselves. We have to be thinking about this, yeah. Which is great, because it actually puts us back in touch with nature, right? Yeah.
Right. And that's the thing, right, is we're talking about getting all these insects and other fauna into the yard too. We can't just think about it at one time a year with the food sources. We also have to think about what are those things doing in winter. And a lot of our insects are here and hunkered down somewhere in the garden, and you get rid of that whole entire, you know, ground cover of leaf litter. Suddenly they don't have that insulation either, and so it's really a cycle that is holistic, and you have to think every season, what are you doing for native plants? Not just in the springtime, not just when you're, you know, going to the garden center and buying a new plant, but all year round. What do those garden practices look like? Let's see, what other questions we got? You got any other thoughts there on that one?
Yeah, ideally it wouldn't be linear. Whatever you're doing isn't linear. You don't just go buy an annual plant and it dies and that's the end of all that went into that, right? It should be circular. Everything we should be doing, if we're not doing it, and I'm guilty of it, we're all guilty as being humans, we're all part of this process, but we need to start figuring out circular systems, because that's what nature provides for us as a model. Like nothing lives on an island, and we definitely can't either. We can't just do things in a linear fashion, and then that's it. It's a total squander of all the resources. So circular. Figure out ways to get like the circle going. Yeah.
Wonderful. Let's circle back and see what other questions we've got. I know we've got a couple other questions. Alrighty. So what are some good part shade native plants? Dog and kid friendly would be great too. Always a fun aspect to it.
Okay. Dog and kid. Dog. I don't know what that means.
I'm gonna guess that, you know, you may have some dogs and kids running through the garden, so maybe they're a little more they're a little tougher than our average plant in that regard. That would be my guess anyway.
Okay. put a fence around, around it all. I would say go with mints. Because mints, you could beat the crap out of them. I mean, but they're rooted in so many different places that even if you chopped them up, they could probably still withstand some abuse. Plus, kids, I mean, it's mint, right? So kids like tactile things, and mint is something great to smell, and you can taste it. You can take it in and show your kid how to make tea with it. You could do all kinds of things with that. Plus, they're great pollinator plants. So we have a number of mints here. Mountain mint, there's a couple of species of mountain mint, narrow-leaf mountain mint, and broadleaf mountain mint. Yeah, mints are great. For your dogs, on the other hand, they probably won't like to eat it. So a lot of times animals, but it won't poison them, right? Because it's mint. It's not going to poison them, but they don't want a mouthful of mint. I can guarantee that. So even if your dog tends to eat plants and then throw them up later or get sick, it might not eat mint just by the smell even, because mint's very strong smelling, and the whole action of those smells and tastes is to actually deter animals from eating it. So maybe those are some good suggestions. Just plants that have strong aromatic smells like herbs would be great. But mints are a good one for the part shade. Bee balms, Monarda species also can handle some part shade, also very aromatic. Also in the mint family, and would tend to be great for pollinators, but also probably your dog's not going to eat it, but your kids would like to enjoy the smell, maybe the taste of it as well. As far as shrubs go, spicebush would be another one. Things that smell and taste are both interesting to kids, but also will deter animals. So like even deer won't mess with these plants either, so unless they're really hungry. I hope that helps. There's a lot of plants out there. Do some research, but that should be some conceptual factors that can help you think about what to choose.
All right, so we got a particularly tough question we're going through next here. I know.
I feared this. What's up?
So how do we tell native versus non-native? How
do you tell?
How do you tell? And I think maybe we can start with maybe if we're in the garden center, we're in a more controlled setting. Like what is there any way to tell? And this is definitely not going to be a universal answer. I can tell you that right now.
Go ask. Go ask. Where, is this a native plant? If they say yeah, next question, where did it come from, right? There's something called provenance, okay? It's where plants came from. When you go to the garden center, you might see this plant, and maybe trees, shrubs, perennials, whatever. And good questions to ask is, where did this plant come from? For example, you might find on the market trilliums, but some homeowner, private landowner in like Tennessee might have opened up his property to trillium harvesting. They dug those up and brought them up here to sell, right? Those trilliums won't fare well here in Ohio. They're not from here in Ohio. They're from south of us. And so their whole adaptation, their bloom time might be off, their toughness to cold might be thrown off because they're adapted for that area and not here. So one, ask. Two, then ask, where did it come from? Specifically, seed source would be ideal, because then you get an idea, is it from our local ecotype, our local genes, our local gene pool here in this area? If it is, it's going to be tough with the soil, it's going to handle the soil, it's going to handle these wacky up and down, is it ever going to get spring actually? It can handle our weather, like perturbances, it can handle some of the diseases that we might find present here. So there's a lot that goes into that. Try to just stick with straight species to get the maximum benefit out of the native plants. And what that means is no cultivars. There's a lot of cultivars out there, and that's kind of like a new thing. Horticulture has picked up the native plant movement and is now kind of tailoring it back into horticulture and developing varieties of plants that have bolstered characteristics. But in bolstering certain characteristics, you may diminish other aspects. For example, with a double-flowered plant, you literally take away all the nectar and pollen from that plant. Like there's very little insect value to that flower any longer. So straight species, ask, go observe. Again, spend some time outside. And if you know what doesn't belong here, then you can key into what does belong here and start looking and just research. If you don't know what it is, there's great formats like iNaturalist, which has gotten really good now at telling you what that plant is through just taking a picture. You take a picture, it tells you what the plant is. And then from there, you can do some research. Go look it up. Wikipedia. Some of these plants are easily researched. And then you can see where it shows up on the planet and what value it has or doesn't, and its growing conditions. Just research some of this. I know that's why I'm here, is to tell you all this, but we got an hour. So.
Yeah, I do think that's a really, really great point, that research component, because it does quite often, get pretty overwhelming and pretty difficult to maybe track it all. And yeah, there's tons of resources out there, but I think one of the things that, as Greg and I were talking beforehand, thinking about what we were going to talk about tonight, it's where do you start? And it's really, you start small. So whether it be you find that one native plant that is a native plant and you found it here locally, whether your local garden center, whatever it may be, start small and work your way up, because there's a huge wealth of knowledge in the native plant world. And we'll talk about some resources later for some of the stuff here in Cincinnati, but I can tell you.
Yeah, I do have one resource right off the top of my mind. I was thinking about the Audubon Society has a page, and I'm sorry, I just thought of it. I don't have that site, but if you do some snooping, you can find their page wherein I think it was for their Planting for Birds campaign, but if you type in your zip code, it'll put out a list for you of the native plants found in your zip code. I think that's a really good start.
All right, yes. So I would agree with Kim. Also comment in here, Pam, if you want to call your local extension office, that's another great resource. They'll definitely give you some starting points, but again, it does take a pretty wide diversity of researching and time to get through it. But, again, start somewhere. All right, so if we are successful removing lesser celandine, oh Lord.
The premise, if we are.
That is a very good premise, because it is not an easy one.
Oh, hi, Monica. Yeah.
What should we plant to try to keep it from coming back? Man, that is just quite the question. Let's see what we got here.
So I gotta admit, defeat, at least for now. The battle's on hold with lesser celandine. Okay, so if you can get it out, congratulations. Tell me how you did. I would love to know. Honestly, I would really like to know, because it's a devil of a plant and it's getting established. If you get rid of it, I would start planting, again, anything that can just compete with it, that can take over space quickly. I would, again, suggest a diversity of plants, and in that way you would have some resiliency. I don't know what the site conditions we're talking about are, because this plant can show up in wetlands, it can show up in the forest, it can show up in grasslands, it can show up in your yard. So I don't really know the conditions that you're facing, but I would say anything that's native, and that I would provide a diversity of plants, because some might be more successful than others. In that plant, again, if you figured out a way to kill it, hit up Parks, Conservation, and Land Management. We got problems, yeah. Not just us. I know a lot of places got a lot of problems with that plant.
Absolutely. Great. Well, I think we do have a few more questions. We'll keep working through here. Keep throwing your questions at us, folks. We'll keep working through what we can here. So as we're looking here at some slopes, so Bradford pear, I know this is one that you and Drew Goebel, your cohort there at the conservation team at Parks, were talking about recently. Maybe we want to talk a little bit about Bradford pear in itself, but then also talking about some of these wetland areas. What some of the removal practices look like, that gets pretty tricky, but maybe we can focus on what some of the replacements are as well once we get through.
So what's the exact question?
So they're asking, they're noticing that there's a lot of calorie pear and honeysuckle, especially in some of the wetland areas. And so, let's go ahead and assume that we're able to remove some of it. What's some good wetland plants that we can talk about in terms of replacement?
So wetlands are funny areas, right? Actually, in Ohio, there were very few, if any, just natural lakes. Most of the lakes that are in Ohio presently are either dammed up or human-made. So beyond that, so there's kind of like a paucity. There are some plants that we have that are like wetland plants. I would definitely suggest like buttonbush, Cephalanthus occidentalis, cool little flower. That guy ranges everywhere. I've seen that thing in Florida swamps, and I've seen it all the way up near beaver dams in New York. So it's definitely a tolerant plant. And it even doesn't have to be in a wetland. That's actually also in my front yard. It's a nice shrub I blocked my neighbors with. It's awesome. Broad leaves, attracts a lot of pollinators, really unique kind of flower shape. I would say any kind of willows will rapidly take over a wetland, and that's what you want to see, something that can compete against some of these. If there are invasives showing up in your wetland, yeah, that'll do very well. People say red twig dogwood, and I've seen that used in restoration projects, but it's not technically native to here. It's a little bit more north of us. Some of viburnum species could do pretty well in some other wetland areas as well. Arrowwood viburnum would be decent. Let me think. We've got a number of trees that could do pretty well as well. Just trying to think of them all. I personally like bulb cypress, even though it's not technically native here. It does occur in the historical record, and a lot of people think that it's going to actually transition north of us as we warm up climate-wise. What else? And I've seen insects, local insects use it, so that's kind of telling to me as well. Yeah, I hope that's enough. I could go on. There's just a lot. When you have to think about something, you can never think of it, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, keep going.
Always put on the spot. All right, so if you plant it, we're going to go with Robert's comment here. If you plant it, they show up. Absolutely true. We've planted a lot of purple coneflower last year for the first time since we lived in Cincy. Our yard was visited by goldfinches.
Yeah, we started just little flying gold gems. They're awesome, yeah.
I apologize if we're having some audio issues. So we have a question about pawpaw trees, planting spot and conditions.
So ideally, they like a little bit of shade. You find them most often in the forest, right? And when you find them in the forest, they're these tall, kind of like scraggly trees, and they leaf out way up high. That's kind of where we find them. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the only place they'll grow. They will grow in some pretty decent sunlight. I wouldn't put them in blazing sunlight, especially if they're very young. You might have to shade cloth them for a couple years while they're young. But once they're pretty well established, I've seen pawpaw turn into a magnificent yard tree. It turns very pyramidal with broad green leaves that turn like golden color in the fall. What I've also noticed is the ones that get a lot more sunlight tend to flower and fruit more, which is also normal for a lot of plants. They'll flower more and fruit more if they're in good sunlight. So I think that's pawpaw is pretty tolerant. The thing you got to watch with pawpaw is it will tend to sucker out and form patches. That could be useful for you, or it could be detrimental. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you just want a singular specimen, then you're going to have to prune around or mow around that pawpaw tree to cut out any of the suckers. That's not what the tree wants. Pawpaw tree, I'll call them a plant. Pawpaw plants, what they actually are trying to do is put one trunk out. That trunk only gets so big. It doesn't ever be a big tree. It lives for just a couple decades, then it dies. But in that process, in that time period, its natural ability would be to sucker out and create a whole grove of trees within that time frame. That's how it's invested its energy into its life, continuing it on. Not into one singular trunk, but into an extensive root system that will keep coming up over many decades. So learn about your plants. Learn how they grow. Learn what they are adapted to. Learn just how they grow. And that'll help you a lot to just understanding them better and how to use them. But pawpaw can be planted in the yard. If you give it a little shade too, it'll love it. But it can also be stuck in pretty deep shade too. Yep.
Great. So we have a question that I know is probably on the minds of many, especially of our suburban listeners out there, which is Yeah, you do. It is deer. So, as many of you are well aware, deer are a major problem, especially for a lot of our great native plants. They love oak saplings. They love a lot of these native plants that are, that we really need in our ecosystem and that support a ton of different flora and fauna. And so, deer pressure has caused a lot of problems, and it's increasingly researched and talked about, and there's more and more out there about deer and how they're actually changing our ecosystems. But for those of us who maybe do have high deer pressure, what are some natives that might escape some of that deer pressure?
Yeah. I'm going to, again, and I'm a plant geek, so maybe this is just my own bent, but go research plants. If you can research plants, especially at the family level, for example, if you know buttercups, ranunculaceae, columbine, marsh marigold, a bunch of plants are in the buttercup family. All of them are toxic. Deer won't eat them, right? That's why lesser celandine, which is in the buttercup family, is not eaten, because its family has these toxins built into it. Other wildflowers like bloodroot, wood poppy, they're in the Paupervaceae family, the poppy family. Deer aren't going to mess with those. Laurel family of plants, right? Spicebush and sassafras. Smelly, very aromatic, strong flavors. Deer aren't going to touch those things. Things in the mint family, bee balm, mint, all the different varieties of mint, and a number of other plants. Again, imagine you're an animal and you have to eat something. Would you want to eat just a mouthful of wax myrtle, and get just all that flavor in your mouth? It's not going to taste very good. So plants like that that are aromatic or have spines is another indicator. Like hollies would do pretty well. They're spiny. Some of our other native plants have spines that will deter some of the deer as well. But deer, I mean, there's a lot of them. There's too many of them. And it's sad. It's really kind of a sad situation because there's so many of them. Not only, as Sam indicated, they're changing the forest community by preferentially eating certain plants and leaving others. Over time, that changes the whole community structure of the forest. But beyond that, there's so many of them that literally by winter, they are starving to death. They've eaten everything that they can eat, right? And now they're eating things that might not even be palatable for them to actually eat, but they're eating it anyway because they're hungry, So it's just really sad, the state of deer. I feel bad for them. It's not their fault, but on the other hand, we've so screwed up their ecosystem. Nothing predates upon them any longer, and so they're just. I feel for them, but I also feel for people and their plants, and even our native plants, which are suffering the consequence of this kind of knock-on effect. We have a great deer hunting program in Cincinnati parks. It's controversial, but if you're interested in helping with the deer population, there are ways to do it, for sure.
Great. And I do apologize. I know we are having some connectivity issues. It always seems to go that way. We are not Facebook Live experts, as I mentioned before, so please give us a little bandwidth here. We will post the recording, so we will have as much of this as we can sharing out there. And we'll keep sharing as many native plant resources as we can throughout this great month of April, which is, as we mentioned earlier, National Native Plant Month. So let's get into some of our resources. We're starting to get fairly close on time here, and Cincinnati is pretty fortunate to have some pretty good local resources. Maybe let's start with sources. Where can we find some of these native plants here locally?
Yeah, some of the native local nurseries that I know offhand. I know the Cincinnati Nature Center has a native plant program, and I believe they started to sell some of their plants. I've seen them at the Midwest Native Plant Conference.
They have.
So check them out. I'm sure they have a sale at some point. You all, don't you have
Civic Garden Center? Absolutely.
Sale, right. I'll let you talk about that in a moment. In addition to that, there's Keystone Flora, which is on the west side. I always support Steve Slack and the work that he's doing over there. The zoo, of course, they have a huge native plants program and nursery that they're building and continuing to build out at Boyer Farms. Brian George's running that, and he's doing some great work out there. She gave him some seeds for yellow passion flower this year, and I'm really hoping they work out for him. And they're always looking for interesting new native plants to bring to people's homes. So keep an eye on what they might have. Yeah, and then there's also the Ohio Native Plant website has a great list of sources as well for native nurseries, native plant nurseries throughout Ohio.
Absolutely. So OhioNativePlantMonth.org, definitely would check that out. Highly would recommend that. There's both sources listed there as well as some broader initiatives that are going on in some different local areas, some more regional, some statewide initiatives, some different things to think about when it comes to Ohio Native Plant Month. How can you celebrate? How can you be an activist and bring along some other folks in this native plant movement and try to really bolster the most out of your yard, out of your knowledge. So definitely check out some of those resources. As Greg alluded to, the Civic Garden Center also does a plant sale, so we will be having an online sale going live starting tomorrow. And so in that will be a handful of native plants and a pretty good selection this year, so please do check it out. You can sort by native plants as well, so those are all going to be kind of sectioned out there, but pretty wide diversity. And more we're actually kind of joining the model that the Cincinnati Nature Center is using in terms of growing their own plants. We talked a little bit about that sourcing aspect earlier, and it's one thing to buy plants in from a nursery that may be not necessarily here in the Cincinnati region, but the best thing you can do is source locally. So we have started sourcing more of our own seeds from a local source from the Ohio Prairie Nursery. So they do a lot of seeds, and with OPN Seeds, we're growing now plants for a fall plant sale. So that fall plant sale is going to be exclusively native plants. They're really targeted at pollinators, host plants, really trying to give you that selection of some good things to find for your yard, and some good sources that are sourced here locally and grown right here at the Civic Garden Center. So with that, let's see. There's some other resources. How about in terms of we want to learn more, we want to educate ourselves more about native plants. We mentioned this guy Doug Tallamy. What are some other? Maybe we can go a little bit more about some of his books. Maybe we can talk about some other individuals that are worth looking into.
Yeah, Doug Tallamy. He's like the guru of all of this stuff. He's an entomologist from the University of Delaware, and he really clued in, like, hey, if you don't provide the plants, the insects don't have anything to eat. If the insects aren't present, then the birds don't have anything to feed their young. So it's, again, this cascading effect, and he really highlighted that in the last couple years with a number of really great books. Check out any of them. They're all great, and it'll really help inform you with that. Beyond that, I know that Mount Cuba Research Institute, they do a lot of work around native plants, especially around gardening with native plants. They're not quite here. I think they're up in like New England more, but a lot of the plants have some overlap as well here. Yeah. What else?
I'm thinking of at least one more. There's a podcast that I think you might be a part of that we should mention.
Yeah, the Nature Guys podcast. We've got over 200 episodes on just about any nature topic. Plants. I'm a co-host on that podcast. I'm usually dealing with the plant situation. So there's some great episodes. In fact, one just dropped today. It's on spring wildflowers. So the ones you would find in your forest. It's definitely worth checking out. Beyond just me being on it, it's a passion project between Bill and Bob. Bill from Cincinnati Nature Center and Bob Stagenborg, who helped put this program together, this podcast. And it's a great podcast. It's nationally recognized. And there's a slew of topics. Almost anything you want to learn about the local nature you can find there. And just to plug myself, when I have time, I make YouTube videos on usually plant-specific topics. So I just made one on how volunteers at Laboda Woods helped save the bluebells, the Virginia bluebells there. So to find that, it's just Greg Torres. Type it into YouTube, you should see this mug, and you'll find the videos there. Yeah.
Well, I think that video you mentioned gets us to maybe our last topic, which is action.
Right, yeah.
What can we do, right? What can we do to beyond our yards, maybe even? We've talked a lot about the resources that you can do in terms of planting up your yard, the reason to do that, the different resources and research to think about as you are planting up your yard, right? That homegrown national forest aspect of making sure we have places for these native flora and fauna to find refuge right there in the city or suburban areas. But what about beyond that? What are some ways that we can take action, maybe starting with Cincinnati parks?
Yeah, with Cincinnati parks, we need help. Our forests are actually under a lot of threat from a number of invasive species, and we honestly find more every single week. We just found some new viburnums that aren't even documented yet. We found Mahonia, Oregon grape holly showing up in the woods. The weeping cherries that everybody loves so much, they're now showing up in several forests here in Cincinnati. It's alarming because these are all new threats. So I think the best way people can get involved is contact myself at Conservation Land Management. You can, I think my email is gregory.torres@cincinnati-oh.gov. I can't believe I did that. But contact me if you want to get involved. We have almost every weekend a volunteer workday working in the forest. Usually almost all of them incorporate some kind of natural education as well. If not just plant ID, we'll work side by side with you. That's what Drew and I, and even Sam, have been trying to build out, like knowledgeable people to work side by side with volunteers to build up like a community of volunteers and a network of people that can help tackle these problems. Because at this point, they're intractable, and we need as much help as we can. And you will learn a lot that you can then translate directly into your yard from the natural world that you're experiencing with us while doing the work. Yeah. And it's fun. And
Absolutely.
You feel good doing it. You did something. You can turn around and say, I saved these trees. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I will echo that on behalf of the Civic Garden Center as well. Tons of volunteer events, whether it be working here on our grounds. We're doing more and more native plants here within our own space and trying to mix them in with some of the ornamentals in a more traditional garden setting and seeing what that looks like and maybe how to start thinking about that in your home. We do a lot of work as well with the Cincinnati, in partnership with the Cincinnati Parks Department at a couple different restoration sites, one of them being Walnut Woods in Evanston. And that site especially is a place where we spend a lot of that time, as Greg mentioned, trying to educate volunteers, trying to spend time out in the field talking plant ID, talking why these plants are a problem from an ecological perspective. So get involved, reach out, give us a call, reach out on our website, whatever it is, leave a comment, and I'll get back to you. And I think that's really one of the most powerful ways that you can make a difference is, get involved. You start to learn a couple of things here and there. You pick up a few things, and then before you know it, you're trying to get involved on a deeper level, right? And when you, a lot of these individuals we've seen who have gotten involved maybe in one or two volunteer events, again, they fall in love, they find that gratification in that invasive removal or learning some of these interesting things about some of these native plants, and they have taken on projects of their own. They've taken maybe ownership of one small corner of the forest, but because they've done that, it's completely changed that little section of the forest and really given way for the native plants to thrive. And so I think that's an especially powerful thing that as much as possible, just get involved.
I'll even go another step. Not everybody can do like me and Sam and wield a machete and just go bash down honeysuckle, right? But we're all part of a community and we all play a role, right? If you can't do that, there's a number of not-for-profits that need support. They need financial support. They need connective support with each other. There's other things that these not-for-profits can do or that need help with, just running a website, for example, so that we can continue doing some of this volunteer work that we do. Civic Garden Center is a great example. It's a not-for-profit. They're doing this to help the community almost with volunteers. We're trying to do this good work, and it just needs to be supported by the community. If it's of value, then it needs to be supported. And that goes not only with here, but Northside Green Space, Preserve Burnett Woods, Friends of all these organizations that are trying to do the good work, they need to be invested in for our community. So just that's it. That's my civic talk.
And on our note of Civic Talks, we will go ahead and wrap things up. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us tonight. Again, we will share this recording. I apologize once again for any of our connectivity issues. We do what we can. And we'll continue talking about native plants. Someone asked for images. Someone asked for, there's some questions that we didn't get to. We'll keep trying to share as much information as we can throughout this month and going throughout the whole year. But if you can, get involved in a volunteer capacity, because that's really the best end-all be-all. If you can't find that way to do the research, to do something in your own little corner, and celebrate National Native Plant Month, tell a friend, buy a native plant, whatever it looks like. All right.
Yeah, reach out if you got questions. Love telling people.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Yep, take care.